Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 47 following episode 7. And this episode was kind of a mess, if I'm being honest, considering the format, but also the way certain people were presented to. There's actually quite a bit of intrigue here with these rankings, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we had 12 people to talk about, and to waste some more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, we have the latest boot from the season, and here we have Tiana, who ends up being the final pre-juror of the season. And I'll admit I made a miscalculation here. I definitely had her too high for really the last couple weeks before her eventual boot here, as there was definitely setup in hindsight to her being taken out, and plenty of people were pretty privy to point that out. However, I still ended up putting her relatively high, even as recently as last week, and I'll own it, I made a mistake there, but if we are looking at the episode itself, I feel like there was definitely plenty said to Tiana being taken out. We're considering they had the whole format of the split tribal, considering how much they really laid it on that Rachel was this easy boot, and considering the actual twist, it just made sense for Tiana to go out by the end of it, where obviously Rachel was presented as too obvious to be taken out, and once the twist came into play where the two Goose were forced to turn on each other, it just made sense for Tiana to go here. I couldn't really imagine Caroline or Sue flipping on Gabe from an in-game standpoint, but even from a storyline standpoint, I feel like Gabe is clearly being set up to be in the game for longer and to be this more overarching villain of the season here, so Tiana going makes quite a bit of sense. And if we're looking at Tiana more generally, she was my winner pick coming into the season, so I didn't quite hit it here this season. However, I don't think she quite panned out as a player, as even though she technically gets screwed over here by the split tribal and the safety without power twist, it seemed like she was already towards the bottom of the Tuku power structure, and she kind of gets lucky that they never went back to tribal after the TK round, as she probably would have been taken out had they ever gone back to tribal in the pre-merge. And even beyond that, you definitely have some not ideal things like her throwing Gabe under the bus before the merge in a spot to where it got back to him. You have her trying to flip the vote onto Gabe in their last round, only for her to get nowhere and for her to not really flip Caroline and not even realizing that Sue was working with Gabe either. So I think from a gameplay perspective, there's definitely some things to be desired from Tiana, and edgically, she was definitely someone who had moments here and there. There was definitely some upside that I saw, however, it just didn't really pan out by the end of it. But obviously she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 12. And before we continue, I am once again partnering up with Russell Muscle TV to promote Idle Plays. Idle Plays is an online shop where you can purchase Survivor puzzles and practice them. That way you can potentially be the next challenge beast on Survivor 47 and beyond. In this season, we have creator lockers. These are special bundles handpicked by myself and other Survivor YouTubers, along with creator trading cards. If you purchase my puzzle, you can get your hands on the Labyrinth Ball puzzle, the Slide puzzle, and Spencer's puzzle from Survivor Cambodia. If you want to take home these puzzles and more, feel free to use my link in the description or use my affiliate code, Survivor Gumball, and start prepping now. And with that, we have 11 people left in the game to talk about. As usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. And as I alluded to in the intro, this was kind of a weird episode with how certain people were presented. And I think now that we're after the merge and we're starting to see where the season is going, I did make some shuffling with the power ranking to reflect how I think these people are going to be doing moving forward. And while some of that's corroborated by stuff that happened in this episode, other things are simply me catching up with things that I observed in previous episodes, but I feel like now is a good time to properly account for them in the rankings. So there is quite a bit of changes here compared to last week, but we'll get to that soon enough. But number 11, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on, is Sam. And this is obviously a big drop off from last week, where Sam was actually number 5 last week, but now he's all the way at the bottom. And I think at this point, it's pretty clear that Sam is screwed. I feel like there's no way that he gets towards the end, and considering the set that we got in this episode to Andy wanting to flip on Sam and Sierra, and seeing him putting in the work and aligning with Saul and with Genevieve, I feel like Sam is probably gone sooner rather than later here, where I feel like within the next 2 episodes, either Sam or Sierra will be out of the game, if not both of them. And I feel like at this point, it's pretty undeniable. I feel like Sam is pretty clearly being set up for a fall. And while this episode didn't really present Sam in that negative a light on his own, I feel like the fact that this episode clearly laid the groundwork for Andy to flip on Sam and Sierra due to them seeing Andy as his third wheel and Andy feeling like he has to change his game accordingly. I feel like it's really just a matter of when Sam goes as opposed to if. And I feel like at this point, with how certain I am that Sam's going out of the game, I did drop him all the way down to number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I just mentioned, but we do have Sierra. And like Sam, Sierra is also screwed. I feel like there's no way she gets towards the end either. I think Annie's pretty clearly the flip on them as soon as next round, considering how things are going. And while Sam is the main target here, where Andy seems to have his eyes more set on Sam due to Sam more clearly playing him, I think there's also a world where Sierra is like the backup target here, where if Sam wins immunity or if there's an idol being played, that Sierra is clearly the fall person here, which could happen if I'm being honest, considering Sierra got content in this episode talking about how Andy's a sloppy player, sort of underestimating Andy once again. So I feel like both Sam and Sierra are pretty screwed here. I feel like Andy will probably try to take both of them out, and one of them's for sure going out within the next couple of rounds. It's just a question of which one goes first. And while I think Sam may be the primary target, I could just as easily see Sierra going out if Sam were to win immunity. And even beyond that, I feel like your edit's kind of going nowhere at this point, where a lot of it is her either underestimating Andy and calling him a bad player, or just getting nothing confessionals like she got when she got the tree mail. So at the end of the day, Sierra's not winning, which is why she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who I'm pretty confident is not winning, but I feel like they have a bit more longevity than Sam and Sierra, but we do have Gabe. Now, again, Gabe was someone who was targeted in this episode where Tiana was clearly gunning for him. However, I never really thought he was going home here. I feel like he was a big enough character to where he probably would survive this round. Not to mention that he's tied into other people's storylines, like with Sue and Caroline, to where it would have been really weird for him to go out here where Caroline and Sue didn't really get to properly turn on him. So at the end of the day, I feel like Gabe was pretty safe for this round, and I feel like moving forward, he's clearly the villain of the season, someone who's definitely like there to be against whoever's going to win, which probably means that he himself is not going to win, because why would they portray their winner in such a villainous way when you have people like Caroline and Sue, for instance, who are clearly meant to like overtake him at some point. So at the end of the day, I feel like Gabe is also not winning. The reason he's above Sam and Sierra is that I feel like he's at least being set up to make it further in the game, where at least we don't have him being flipped on immediately, considering the people still in the game at this point, where the main person that wanted to flip on him was Tiana, but Tiana's out of the game now. I feel like Gabe has a bit more legs to run on, to where I can't really see him going out before either Caroline or Sue pick up on him, like playing them. So at the end of the day, I feel like Gabe is a little bit above Sam and Sierra, to where he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have the person who was at the bottom of last week's ranking, but we do have Saul. And again, Saul's not winning. I feel like my view of him didn't really go up in this episode. It was just more so other people going down that really causes him to be higher here. Where I feel like the one way he truly went up was in the sense that he made the jury, where obviously for a lot of the season, I talked about how he came off as someone that would be cut right before the jury, sort of like the 10 Spicer of the season, though obviously that couldn't happen considering he was immune for that round. So at least he made the jury. I am happy for him in that sense, but he's still not winning. And even this episode, his main content is circumstantial, where obviously he has to do damage control with Andy after the tribal, but even then that gets overshadowed by what Andy's doing, and later Andy deciding to work with Genevieve. So I feel like Saul gets overshadowed there. And then even beyond that, you get more circumstantial content of him finding the advantage and deciding what to do with it, which is obviously funny in the sense that we get to see him putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. But beyond that, there's no storyline here. I feel like Saul is still going nowhere on the season. It wouldn't shock me if he's a boot in the next couple of rounds regardless, but it's just the fact that other people went down, plus the fact that he's at least going to be on the jury, was enough to have him above those other people, but really he's still going nowhere, which is why he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another person who I'm pretty sure is not winning at this point, and could also see him being taken out relatively soon, but we do have Kyle. And I feel like outside of Sam and Sierra, I think Kyle's probably one of the more likely people to be booted relatively soon as well, where considering that he's already won 2 immunities, I can see a lot of the players in the game seeing him as his physical threat to be taken out. He's also the 4th in the Tuku power structure, so I could see the Gabe, Caroline, Sue alliance throwing him to the wolves. And I feel like from an Ed standpoint, I feel like there's not really much there either, where at this point he's kind of just getting circumstantial content only being shown when it's absolutely necessary. And I feel like there's no storyline at this point for Kyle to really go on to win the game. So I feel like mixing those things with the fact that he is seeming to be a threat that could be taken out soon, I'm just not feeling the greatest about Kyle at this point. And could easily see him being taken out if it's not Sam or Sierra in the next couple of episodes. So because of that, I do have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who has actually gone up yet again compared to last week. By number 6, we do have Rachel. And Rachel's been on a bit of an upward trajectory in recent weeks where I felt like she had a decent enough merge episode. And even this episode was actually not that bad for her, where she obviously got a decent amount of focus. And while that could have been said to her being like the boot here, where I feel like she could have been like this early merge boot, and truth be told, I could still see her being an early merge boot. I think there's definitely some things you can point to in these last couple episodes that could lead to her being this big character later on. Where in this episode, you have her being talked about as this big threat. You also have her like talking about wanting to work with a woman and how this women's alliance could lead to something. So I think there's definitely legs for Rachel to stand on here. And now that she's still in the game and going to be this force in the future, I can definitely see a path for Rachel to be a major contender in the season. Now, truth be told, I feel like compared to the people above her, I feel like those people have more going for them and had more going for them from earlier on the season. But I feel like there's enough there with Rachel. I could definitely see her having this big turnaround to where I did decide to leave her relatively high at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have yet another person who has been on an upward trajectory, and here we have Genevieve. Now, admittedly, I am not a Genevieve truther. I feel like there have been a lot of people online who have been so adamant about Genevieve winning the season, and I have simply not been on that bandwagon simply because a lot of her content has been circumstantial, and considering that just last week we saw her not really getting much to do with the eventual Rome takeout, even though she was set up to flip on Rome at some point. So I feel like there have been some pretty big red flags with Genevieve's edit here that I'm not ignoring. However, I feel like this episode was pretty good for her, where she does at least have some setup to a future storyline, where we see her talking about working with Andy and how she feels like she needs her own number 1 now that she has lost her number 1, which, again, why didn't she get more focus during the Rome Boot episode, but who's counting? But I feel like this could definitely be a good path forward for Genevieve, where she ends up working with Andy for a lot of the post-merge, being involved in some big moves and taking out Sam and Sierra. And I think there's definitely a path there for Genevieve to have this winning trajectory and to have this winning story across the season. Now, admittedly, I think there are still plenty of reasons to doubt her, considering how bad her pre-merge was, at least in my eyes. But I feel like the fact that she's now getting the storyline is something that I can at least give her. I feel like it's enough to prop her up. And considering that her content here was less necessary compared to Rachel's, where Rachel got a lot of content simply because she was on the bottom and was in a lot of danger going home there, that was enough to have her above Rachel. And I feel like with them both being on this upward trajectory, I did decide to leave Genevieve relatively high, all things considered. So where she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this person has also gone up compared to last week. But number 4, we do have Caroline. And at this point, I think Caroline's in a pretty good spot. I feel like she is obviously aligned with Sue, who, as I mentioned in previous weeks, has been a major character in the season. And while I have criticized Caroline in the past for coming off as a sidekick to Sue, I feel like this was a good enough focus episode for her, where for once, Caroline's the one getting the bulk of the focus for the duo here, where she talked quite a bit about how she needs to take out Rachel due to Rachel being the glue holding Gabe together. And while she doesn't get her way, I mean, I don't think there's really much she could have done about that. I mean, Rachel literally played her safety without power at the last second. So I don't really fault Caroline for getting that confessional there, not really getting her way, considering that they wanted to make the safety without power a surprise, and there really wasn't much at it for her voting out Tiana anyway. But I feel like the fact that Caroline talked about wanting to make the smart move as opposed to the easy move, which I think is pretty decent content there. And while you can definitely question whether taking out Tiana was the quote-unquote easy move or the quote-unquote smart move, I do think at the end of the day it was probably the smart move for Caroline, considering she is in this pretty tight alliance with Sue and Gabe, and considering that Gabe is his perfect shield for her. I do think it's probably the smart move for Caroline to be making. And I think that's probably what the show would probably justify as well, considering Tiana was on to Sue, who was her closest ally there, and knew about Sue's secret that Caroline also knows about. So I do think at the end of the day, this is a positive for Caroline, and considering how other people are going down, I feel like that does still leave Caroline with this clear opening to potentially win the game in the future, possibly even inherit some of the edit that Sue has gotten. So I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like I am sliding up on Caroline, and while there are still plenty of issues with her edit, particularly in the pre-merge, I did decide to have Caroline here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and believe it or not, I do have the same top 3 as last week, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 3, and I did deliberate this a little bit, but number 3, I did decide to stick with Sue. Now, this was a very strange episode for Sue here, as she literally got zero confessionals in this episode, which I wasn't expecting for the post merge. I would think that with the split tribal and with there only be 12 people left, that surely everyone would get at least one confessional. But not only is there a zero confessional person in this episode, that person is Sue of all people. This person who I have been somewhat high on for a good amount of the season, and someone who I thought I was ready to have a number one after this latest episode. But instead, I mean, Sue gets pretty much nothing here, and I'm not really sure what to make of that, especially since it's Tiana that gets taken out, this person that was providing a source of adversity for Sue, considering that Tiana was suspecting Sue of having an idol, which was actually a big reason why I had Sue so high to begin with, considering that something we've seen in recent seasons with winner edits is that the winner's given this source of adversity in the pre-merge, where going back to 46, you have Kenzie, who had to deal with being this big threat from the likes of Banu and Jess, only for that to be resolved by the merge. And probably the most extreme example of this being Erica from 41, where the show pretended that Erica was in danger and that Danny and Deshawn were trying to throw the challenge to get rid of Erica, when in reality they were trying to get rid of Sydney. So I feel like Sue getting this content of Sue seemingly being in danger with Tiana suspecting her of having the idol, even though it wasn't really that much adversity, and Tiana has actually admitted in her exit interview that she actually wanted to work with Sue after the merge after finding out that she had the idol, I feel like that would have been a clear checkbox to check off with Sue to show that she is in line with these other winners. And while I still think it is a checkbox at the end of the day and something that can definitely propel Sue in the future, the fact that she gets no content in the episode where Tiana goes home, even though she was clearly on board to stick with Gabe the whole time, is probably a big knock at the end of the day, and a reason why I don't have her higher. And I think another thing to factor in here is Tiana's exit interview, where Tiana was particularly upset with Sue in her exit interview, talking about how like Sue would cry every day in the pre-merge, how she made the TK vote a personal thing, about how she personally didn't like TK's character and wasn't really voting based off gameplay reasons. And again, while Tiana's a pre-juror and won't have a direct hand in how the game plays out, I feel like the fact that Sue has this perception of taking things personally and getting emotional is definitely something that could bite her back from an in-game standpoint. I could definitely see that leading to her like being a losing finalist at the end. And while it's too early to definitively say that, I think that was still something worth mentioning in regards to her replacement here. So at the end of the day, I'm still a bit conflicted over where to properly place Sue in this ranking here. Now, I have seen some people online saying that this was the death nail for Sue's winner edit and how there's no way that she can win because she got zero confessionals. And I'm not on that boat, to be honest. I still think there's a way that Sue can recover from this. I still think Sue is someone who, up to this point, has been getting a mostly solid edit. And I feel like with other people going down, I feel like that definitely leaves Sue with the opportunity to have a winner's edit, but still a knock at the end of the day, and was enough to leave her relatively behind at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have the same person at number 2 as I had last week, but we do have Andy. And there was definitely a debate for Andy being lower here, as well as even though he is getting the setup to a storyline where he is going to flip on Sam and Sierra, and that he's laying the groundwork to do so by aligning with Saul and with Genevieve, we still get some negative content from him in this episode, where during the reward, we see him looking for the advantage and having both Sierra and Genevieve talking about how he's being sloppy and that if you're going to look for the advantage, you have to actually find it, only for Andy to not find it and for Saul to find it instead. And I feel like they didn't need to show that, so the fact that they did is probably a knock against Andy. And beyond that, there's still the same general concerns about whether he's just there as a journey edit, whether he's just going to be Emily or not. And I am probably starting to lean more into that camp now than I have before, especially now that I'm looking back on his merge episode. So again, I think there's definitely a debate for Andy to be lower, and truth be told, there may actually be a debate for him to be lower as soon as next week. But I feel like for now, considering he has his setup to flip on Sam and Sierra, which is something that I'm pretty confident will go through, I am still willing to leave Andy relatively high here at the end of the day, which is why he's still here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 47 at this point is still Teenie. And I feel like this was a pretty good episode for Teenie here, considering they didn't really have that much to do, where I feel like a lot of it was them getting unnecessary content, where first up, you had them at the beginning of the episode talking about how they're glad that the ambulance out of the game and that now Saul has to do damage control with Andy, which is pretty interesting considering they're not the one doing damage control. So the fact that we got their perspective anyway is probably a good sign. It felt like that the show went out of their way to show Teenie there, which is pretty good. And even beyond that, you have them talking about how they want the Women's Alliance to go through and that they feel like that a Women's Alliance should be successful in this season, which again was pretty unnecessary as well, considering the Women's Alliance couldn't really come into play in this vote, considering the split tribal. But I feel like that's another thing that could lead to Teeny doing well if this women's alliance were to go through. So I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like there wasn't really anything to move Teeny down. If anything, I feel like that the show went more out of their way to show Teeny this episode when they didn't need to. And I feel like it's all been pretty good for the most part. And with me still having plenty of question marks with Sue and Andy, where I feel like both of them had pretty questionable aspects to their edits in this episode, I feel like I had to leave Teeny at the top here, considering the way things are standing at this current moment. So because of that, they're still here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon and I have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.